I'm being told I'm on.
I must be deaf. It's my age.
Yeah, Lois says she must be going deaf. But we're looking at the new atheist claim that the God of Scripture is a moral monster, one who's not worthy of worship. And they bring a number of specific charges under this category. We're currently examining the claim that God's regulations regarding slavery are immoral. That's one of the things that they say. Now, looking first at slavery in the Old Testament, I explained last week that the so-called slavery that God permitted among his covenant people, Israel, really is not slavery, but a voluntary form of debt servitude. It was a way of paying off a debt or a way of attaching oneself to someone else's household to survive poverty and destitution. It was a different world. It was a different economic environment. Right when the class ended, I was explaining that this option of debt servitude in ancient Israel, it really served a humanitarian function, and it did this in two ways. It facilitated lending, and it did that in that the borrower would say, the person who needed money would say to the lender, look, I will either repay this loan through the labor that I will provide or somebody from my family will provide, or it was security for the loan that was to be repaid back some other way. In other words, if I don't repay it back this other way by a certain time, then I will give you my labor. So it was security. So you see, it facilitated, lubricated the lending of money. And that was something that was a positive function. And in addition, it simply allowed the destitute to become bond servants in exchange for shelter and provision. So if I have nowhere to go, I have nothing, I could go and attach myself to someone's household as a bond servant, and then when I'm in that household, I receive the provision of that household. My alternative was to sit out here and do what? Maybe beg and see what I could get from that. So it functioned as kind of a social safety net. It was a way for the destitute to survive in a harsh economic environment. You think of somebody today, for example, who enlists in the military out of economic distress. You can think of somebody who has no options, no work, and they then say, okay, what can I do? They enlist in the military out of economic distress. Well, in that case, that person, he or she voluntarily relinquishes a large part of control over his or her life for a set number of years in exchange for what the military provides for them. During that time, the military will house them, provide for them, give them training, and when they're out, give them certain benefits. It's kind of that idea. When somebody becomes a debt servant, they come in, it's for 6 years, and when they go, they have to be given provision sufficient for them to move on. Now, before addressing the fact that God allowed the Israelites to have non-Israelites, see, we were looking in the Old Testament, we're looking at so-called slavery within the covenant community. I'm going to look at slavery with non-Israelites. But before I do that, I want to alert you to a couple of texts that are often misapplied by critics. So we'll be looking at the fact that non-Israelites, Israelites could have non-Israelites as permanent slaves who could be transferred. But before I look at that, let's look at a couple of texts that are often misused. One of them is, there are more than this, and we could talk about others, but these are common ones that I see. Exodus 21, 3 and 4. These verses, they address the case of a debt servant who during the time of his debt servitude, see, this is put up as a saying, well, look here, the wife and children, they're held in captivity in perpetuity and this kind of thing. They always take the least charitable view and promote that as the only understanding of the text and then try to put God in the dock based on that. But in this text, you see, it's a case of a debt servant who during the time of his debt servitude married another of the master's debt servants and had children with her. And there's good reason to think that
the case that's given here, that it wouldn't be limited to males. That's simply the typical case that is given for the principle. And when this person's service period was up, he was free to go, but he couldn't take his wife and children with him because they were still under a service obligation. They had still received something, and they're under a service obligation of 6 years. He comes in, they overlap, they meet, they get married. His time is out, and he can go out, but she can't because she's still under that obligation. Now, that doesn't mean that the wife and children remain servants for the rest of their lives. That's never the case with Israelite servants. The period of time was limited to 6 years. It means that the husband, he could work somewhere else. If he could find somewhere else to go, he could work somewhere else while he waited for his wife to complete her service obligation, and then they could be reunited. Or he could make enough money somewhere else that he could buy out the remainder of the wife's service contract. So if he could do that, if he was able to earn enough money, he could then come there and say, okay, here's the money that'll buy out that contract. And so he could do that. Or he could agree to continue working permanently for the master and say, this is such a acceptable deal here. I will just continue, and my wife and I and our kids will continue attached to your household. So it's not the case that they wind up saying, okay, he goes out and then the wife and kids stay permanently with the master. Exodus 21, 7, 11. Now, some of these things you see, part of the ambiguity, the uncertainty, is they're dealing with arcane matters of ancient Israelite law that's hard for us to know the details from this distance. You see, there's a lot going on, and we saw that when we studied Ruth. There's an awful lot going on with these marriage laws and things that are like you see pieces of it, but you're not really clear on the details of things. Well, Exodus 21, 7 to 11, you see it says here, when a man sells his daughter as a servant, she shall not go out as the male servant. They say, you see, she's just property. The men get a break. But in Deuteronomy 15:12, it makes specific that male and female, they go out after 6 years. So something else is going on here. And what this is about, it involves a situation where a woman's family makes a contract for her to become both a servant and then a wife. So there are both elements that are involved here. So the payment to her family would include the contract labor payment, and it would include the marriage gift, which is sometimes called the bride price. And that's put in these just bad terms. Oh, people are just out buying people. You see, put out that way. But this bride price, all marriages in the ancient world were arranged. You see, and there are many places where they're still arranged. India being one of them. Now that's straight, that's just horrible. That's how it was. Because the families understood that they were in a better position to provide for their daughter. So they're not sitting here saying, I hate you, I think I'm going to ship you off somewhere. Although, of course, sinful human beings being what they are, I'm sure that happens sometimes. But the idea was that I'm going to try to do best for you because I love you. So we're going to make sure that we have families that go together, that fit together, and I'm going to put you in the best circumstance that I can. You see, so the marriage gift that was given, the so-called bride price, it compensated the family for the loss of the woman's services who's leaving that family and going with the other family, and it probably ultimately belonged to the wife as security for her in the case of divorce or in the case that her husband died. So here's this price that we give you. Your daughter is coming into our family. You're losing all of her services. And what happens if the husband divorces or dies? Well, this price that I've given to you, you hold that in trust for her so she has something to fall back on in that event. You see, so that's the idea of what's behind this. It's always painted in a certain way. That, they don't care anything about. All parents care about their daughters. You see? Now, can you have crazy people who don't? I understand that. You see? But parents are parents. And it's just a different social setting, one that strikes us as odd, but as I say, is around, in antiquity, it was all over the place, and it still exists in many places today. Well, what this is, see, a man he would take a woman as both a servant and a wife. Now you say, why would he ever do that? Well, perhaps it's had something to do with the laws to prevent the children from that marriage, the marriage of a servant, where a man marries a servant. Perhaps it had something to do to protect the inheritance of the children that he had by a prior marriage. Let's say he's a widower and he's got children, and they are on property now. That the children of the wife who was a servant don't stand in the same relationship as the children of the wife who was not. That's what Douglas Stewart argues in his commentary on Exodus, that would be the motivation. In the Jewish Study Bible, they suggest that the father would give a child who's a minor before the marriage age, and that child would then work as a servant until the age of marriage. Now, there's dispute about how long, but let's say it's 20. So here's a 15-year-old or an 18-year-old or wherever you put the age of marriage, and they come in first while they're under that age, work as a servant, but the deal is, I will take her into my household until she's of marriageable age, and when she reaches that, I will marry her. So she will serve as a servant and then wife. Okay, why would somebody do that? Well, perhaps there's a well-to-do family, and we are in economic distress, and they will take my daughter in as a household member, and then the head of the household will marry her. Well, that was a good deal for me, for her. You see, so she will then be the wife in a well-to-do family, so I'm looking out for them. So that would be another reason where you would want to have both of those, you see. So in this situation, you see, when you have both, there is this servant element and there is this wife element. That's why she doesn't go out as the male servants do, because she has this lifelong commitment aspect of being a wife. It's not like, oh no, the women got to stay and the men get to go after 6 years. Deuteronomy 15:12 says no. Male or female go out in 6 years. So what's this about? That's what I'm trying to tell you. You see this, and you see in the other verses, you see the complication that arises here. According to verse 8, so this man brings her in under this situation of where she's going to be a servant and a wife. He brings her in, and according to verse 8, if for some reason the man chooses not to marry her, the way it phrases it, breaks faith. So here I am, we've had this deal. You give me your 16-year-old daughter. She will work as a servant for 2 years, and then she'll become my wife when she's 18. Let's just pick ages. Okay? And so I have her for a while, and I decide, nah, I'm not going to marry her. Well, you're not doing right by me or her, right? Because that was the deal that we have. So he winds up saying, listen, I'm not going to marry. Well, in that case, when he does that, then she has to be redeemed, allowed to be redeemed. In other words, the family can then say, well, okay, here, we're going to give you X amount of money, and she's coming back. Okay? You've broken faith with her. Now you say, why does this guy get any money at all? I don't know the amount. It could have been he took a beating in the deal. But he still got something because he has paid to the family both the contract labor price and the bride price. So he's out. Even though it's his fault, she must be allowed to be redeemed when he breaks faith and says, I'm not going to marry you. So now the family can come in and say, okay, so we're going to redeem her. We'll give her whatever it is. How much money? We'll give to you, and then she returns to her former state. So that, you have that that's what this is about, since he's broken faith with her. He's entitled to some kind of compensation because he's out quite a bit. How much does he get? It doesn't say. Now, according to verse 10, if he chooses then to marry somebody else, you see, he's broken faith. He has not married this woman. That was the original intention, but he's not married her. If he marries another person, like the ESV says, he takes another wife, and you might think from that means he married her. No, he didn't marry her. The NIV translates, says, marries another woman. You see, takes another wife instead of her, not in addition to her. He marries somebody else. Well, in that case, what's the danger? Well, the danger then, let's say that we have the woman who comes in as a servant and is to be a wife. Guy winds up saying, hey, I'm not going to marry her. Okay, she's then able to be redeemed. Well, while the family's gathering the money, or maybe the family, it's going to take them a while to do that. She stays on in that man's household as a servant. He then marries somebody else. Maybe that's why he chose not to marry her. But he marries somebody else. Well, then the rule is, if you do that, you better not cut her. What are these things that he says here? He shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her shelter. I put shelter in there because that's probably the better way to understand that word. That word occurs only here. You'll have many translations that will say marital rights, but Richard Davidson and many others make lengthy arguments persuasive in my judgment that the better translation is shelter. He didn't marry her. There aren't any marital rights. But what he can't do is diminish her food, clothing, and shelter and start stiffing her because he's now got a wife. If he does that, well, then she goes and he gets nothing. Okay? Then she just gets to leave and he gets nothing. He doesn't get the redemption price that he would otherwise get from the family, whatever that amount was. Okay, so I think that's what's going on there, and I think that's important to recognize. Now, in considering the case of non-Israelites, I've been looking at first slavery within the Israelite community, so-called slavery within the community of Israel. Then I looked at a couple of verses or sections, text, that I think are often misused to try to make God look bad. Now, with regard to slavery in the case of non-Israelites, it's important to recognize that slavery was a post-fall human institution. It is not something that is ordained by God. It is not like marriage. God creates the institution of marriage. See, that's from Him. Slavery is not like that. Nothing in Scripture approves of slavery as a moral good. Scripture reveals that God tolerated a regulated form of old world slavery. So He didn't endorse it or institute it. He tolerated it. And He didn't tolerate it the way it existed. He tolerated a regulated form of it. And the institution then was old world slavery. It wasn't new world slavery, the slavery we think of whenever we hear the word slavery. They were different institutions, but He tolerated a regulated form of old world slavery. Now, it's true that the Israelites in the Old Testament, they were permitted to have non-Israelites as permanent slaves who could be transferred to others. But these slaves, they had some protections that were unique in the ancient world. They had some protections that were unique. For example, the slaves were required to be given rest on the Sabbath. You say, this didn't exist in other cultures. You just work the guy all the time. Not so with the non-Israelite who's the slave of the Israelite. He is to be given rest on the Sabbath. And the slaves, they were to be avenged if the master killed them, which probably means the master was to be killed. So it isn't like this guy, hey, just go ahead, do him, whatever you think, go ahead, kill him, do anything. No, he was to be avenged. If he was killed, what did I say? Probably means that the master was to be killed. The slaves were to be released if they were permanently injured, such as the loss of a tooth, through the overzealous discipline of the master. So this guy gets furious with the slave. I don't know what he's doing. Maybe he's stealing. You see, maybe he's doing something else. Maybe he's, and this guy goes crazy, hits him and breaks his tooth. Out. He goes free. What is that? Well, see, that's a regulation on the degree of discipline that this guy can administer. Because if he does that and permanently injures him, even to the point of like breaking a tooth, well, then you've lost all of that. So I'm just letting you see that there are regulations here that are unique in the ancient world. And apparently the slaves were to be avenged in some way if they were disciplined so hard as to take longer than a day or two to recover. Now, when you look in the NIV 1984, that edition, it says, if he gets up after a day or two. The current NIV, 2011, the TNIV also, they say, if he recovers after a day or two. Rather than what some other translations say, if he survives a day or two. Well, that's completely different. You see, the idea is that, well, that he's to be avenged in some way. But look, if the guy lingers for a couple of days, then he's not, as though you're allowed to beat him to death. No, it's like, let's say I discipline this person for stealing from me. And I wail on him. And he's then really, really sore. He can't have a permanent injury because then he walks. But let's say I do that, I'm going to make you so sore like, would you ever have said that to a kid? I'm going to make you so sore you're not going to be able to get up for a day or sit for a day, something like that. You see? So this person, he recovers after a day or two that disciplined, he's disciplined so hard as to take longer than a day or two to recover, well, then he's to be avenged in some way. Doesn't spell out how. Perhaps the way he's to be avenged in that case is that he's required to have his medical services paid. If he gets up, if he's sore for a day, if he's too sore to be able to do anything for a day, and the next day he's recovered and fine, well, then the slave is not avenged on the master. He lost a day of the slave's work. Too bad for him. Next time maybe he won't beat him so hard. But he's not avenged. And as I say, avenged here probably means to pay. So if I beat him so hard that he can't get up in 2 days, he's not recovered in 2 days, well, then he's to be avenged, which probably means or may mean that he's to pay his medical expenses for the recovery. Okay, I just want you to see the caricature that is portrayed just by the word slavery. You say, okay, right away I'm thinking, here, this is a different institution, and God has regulated this institution in a way that was absolutely unheard of in the ancient world. So this is what he's doing in that case. Now, by the way, punishing or disciplining somebody physically for misbehavior is not inherently immoral. I know many people in our society are telling us that, but it's not inherently immoral to discipline somebody physically, right? I spanked my kid and made no apology for it. That's just that. So you say, oh, no, you can't ever strike somebody. No, somebody steals from you, perhaps the right thing is to strike them. Why? We're going to teach them you don't do that anymore. Okay? We're going to teach them something. So I just wanted to point that out. Now, God's concern, see, the idea is that, well, the non-Israelites, God doesn't care about human beings at all. Well, I've already showed you that when Israel has non-Israelite slaves, they have protections that are unheard of. But God's concern for the welfare of aliens and sojourners within Israel is expressed in many places. His concern for non-Israelites, when he says in Leviticus 19:33 and 34, when a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So this attempt to paint God as he only cares about, and you go ahead and you just treat them like dogs. Beat them, kill them, do anything you want to them. Because God's only interested in people. He doesn't care about human beings and humanity. Okay, no, he was very concerned about the welfare of aliens within Israel. And you get an indication of how God desires all servants and all slaves to be treated from Job's declaration of his righteousness. You remember when Job, he's sitting here and saying, listen, I'll put my life record against anybody. And Job says in 31:13-15, if I've rejected the cause of my manservant or my maidservant, New American Standard, New Revised Standard say my male or female slaves. As I say, the words can cover servant slaves. If I've done to my servants or slaves, if I've rejected the cause of my servants or slaves, when they brought a complaint against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? When he makes inquiry, what shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make him the servant or the slave? He says, and did not one fashion us in the womb? Aren't they people made by God? Okay? So he's holding up, this is his defense of his righteousness. So you see, that's the attitude. That's God's look and God's spirit toward people. And it's noteworthy in terms of God's attitude towards slavery that Deuteronomy 23:15 and 16, it required Israel to offer safe harbor to runaway foreign slaves. presumably those who had fled to Israel from other nations. It says, you shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst in the place that he shall choose within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. You shall not wrong him. So this is significant, it seems to me. And when a runaway slave comes, that's it. You protect him and you let him live wherever he wants. That seems to me to be an insight into the character of God. Now, the question that arises in this non-Israelite context where God allows Israelites to have non-Israelites as permanent slaves and to be transferred to others, is it possible, when we're going to judge the morality of God in this, the question has to be, is it possible that an infinite, all-knowing God could have a reason for allowing Israelites to acquire foreigners as permanent workers, especially given his humanitarian regulation of that relationship? Is it possible that an omniscient God could have a morally sufficient reason for that? Is it possible that maintaining a distinction in this regard between covenant people and those outside the covenant served a higher purpose, perhaps by emphasizing the link between divine blessing and covenant membership? You recall that foreigners could convert to Judaism. They could convert to Judaism, you see in Exodus 12, 48 and 49, and thus share in all the blessings of God. So could God have a reason saying that, you see, this distinction exists because what I want you to see is that blessings are tied to covenant membership? Could he be doing that? Could he be doing something else? How can we say that's impossible? That God in this context can't be doing something, especially given the humanitarian regulations that he places on it. I think God can be, and I think God is. See, it strikes me as arrogant to insist that he could not possibly have a purpose for this. But this is where people park and they make a lot of hay out of this. Now, as for the New Testament, so I've been looking at Old Testament. I looked at Old Testament in terms of so-called slavery within the people of Israel, slavery of non-Israelites. Now, slavery in the New Testament, you see, slavery was a basic social institution of first century Greco-Roman society. Scott Barchi, who's an expert on this subject, this is his, I'm sure he does many other things, but he gets called on a lot to write the encyclopedia articles and all this. This is an area in which he spent a great deal of time and study. Barchi says in the Dictionary of the Later New Testament and its developments, he says as many as 1/3 of the population of the empire were enslaved, and an additional large percentage had been slaves earlier in their lives. So when we're talking about Greco-Roman slavery in the first century, you have to see how wide and deep the institution was. It also was a very different institution from the institution we know as slavery, early American slavery. Barchi writes in his article on Greco-Roman slavery in the Anchor Bible Dictionary, now this is 5 slides, but I want to paint this for you so you'll see the difference. He says, central features that distinguish first century slavery from that later practiced in the New World are the following. And I think we went through at least some of this in the Bible and homosexual conduct. Racial factors played no role. Education was greatly encouraged. Some slaves were better educated than their owners, so education was greatly encouraged and enhanced the slave's value. Many slaves carried out sensitive and highly responsible social functions. Slaves could own property, including other slaves. Their religious and cultural traditions were the same as those of the freeborn. No laws prohibited public assembly of slaves, and perhaps above all, the majority of urban and domestic slaves could legitimately anticipate being emancipated by the age of 30. It must be stressed that despite the neat legal separation, I'm getting an awful lot of hyphens in here, despite the neat legal separation between owners and slaves, in none of the relevant cultures did persons in slavery constitute a social or economic class. Slaves' individual honor, social status, and economic opportunities were entirely dependent on the status of their respected owners, and they developed no recognizable consciousness of being a group or of suffering a common plight. They identified with their masters. That was their status and standing. It wasn't that we are all a group of slaves. No, you're a slave to this guy, in this part, in this setting, in this status, and I'm here. We're not the same. You see? So it says, for this reason, any such call as slaves of the world unite would have fallen on completely deaf ears. Furthermore, by no means were those in slavery regularly to be found at the bottom of the social economic pyramid. That's another thing we tend to think of. They were destitute way down here. That's not true. That was reserved for day laborers. Free people who had to hire themselves out in an economic situation that was not good. But he says here, rather, in that place were those free and impoverished persons who had to look for work each day without any certainty of finding it, day laborers, some of whom eventually sold themselves into slavery to gain some job security. I mean, you talk about a jungle out there. It was a jungle out there. And so some of them did that. Large numbers of people sold themselves into slavery. These paragraphs are not continuous, but I've got the ellipses there, so they're in order, but they're not continuous. It says large numbers of people sold themselves into slavery for various reasons: to pay debts, to climb socially. Roman citizenship was conventionally bestowed on a slave released by a Roman owner, to obtain special jobs, and above all, to enter a life that was more secure and less strenuous than existence as a poor, freeborn person. Slaves were used for an enormous variety of functions in enormously different circumstances, some of which, when compared to New World slavery, colonial slavery, the slavery we know, some of which, when compared to New World slavery, seem astonishingly responsible. Doctors, teachers, writers, accountants, agents, bailiffs, overseers, secretaries, and sea captains. Since slaves represented a substantial investment by their owners, they could at least expect to receive enough food to keep them alive and working. Manumission, letting them go, could mean the end of that security. Epictetus, a first-century philosopher, himself an ex-slave, took pleasure in pointing out that the slave who thinks only of gaining his freedom may be reduced when he is manumitted to a slavery much more severe than before. In other words, being cast out on trying to scuffle and survive in the economy. He says, for many, self-sale into slavery with anticipation of manumission was regarded as the most direct means to be integrated into Greek and Roman society. For many, this was the quickest way to climb socially and financially. As such, in stark contrast to New World slavery, Greco-Roman slavery functioned as a process rather than a permanent condition, as a temporary phase of life by means of which an outsider obtained a place within a society that has no natural obligations of kinship or guest friendship towards him. So I just want you to see, this always struck me years ago when I was digging into this and trying to understand some of this, that these distinctions, I think, are important. Because we jump to this. So what we have here, we've got this institution of slavery. Greco-Roman slavery in the first century was different than colonial slavery for all of these reasons. But, okay, how does God do it? God doesn't simply endorse that. Again, he tolerates a regulated form. He will regulate this, a regulated form of first century slavery. The seeds for the dissolution of all slavery. Those seeds were sown in Old Testament texts like Exodus 21:16. You steal a man and sell him, death penalty. Okay? Somebody gets caught with the guy who was stolen and put into slavery, death penalty. You see that? Leviticus 25:39, if your brother sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. That's within Israel, right? Philemon 16, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave as a dear brother. Ephesians 6:9, masters, do not threaten your slaves. Colossians 4:1, masters, provide what is right and fair. 1 Timothy 6:1 and 2, masters are brothers. Masters are brothers. And you see also Jesus teaching about mercy and forgiving debts in Matthew 6:12 and Matthew 18:23 through 34. It implies the inappropriateness of debt slavery. So you have these things that are being said, and these things that the edge is being taken off some of these things. And as many people have said, where these seeds of equality that you see, right, they're brothers. Don't threaten your slaves. Better than a slave is a dear brother. What is right and fair? As people have said, when these seeds of equality came to full flower, the very institution of slavery would no longer be slavery. You see, when this happened, you see, when these seeds, the implications of these seeds grew, well, that would be the end of slavery. You see, that would be the end of slavery. Now, early Christians understood this. They not only demonstrated a radically different attitude toward slaves, dealing with them as they did freemen. Why? Because they're to treat them this way, right and fair. There's a master, they have a master. You got a master. So you better treat them right and fair. How would you want to be treated? Well, that's important. See, that's quite a change. The Lord has called me in this relationship to transform it. To transform it. So Christians, they treated them as they did freemen, and they began the practice of freeing slaves. Early Christians did this. They began the practice of freeing slaves one by one as they had the opportunity. There are reports of early Christians releasing huge numbers of slaves. Huge numbers of slaves, regarding which Philip Schaff, in his work, The History of the Christian Church, Schaff says, these legendary traditions, these stories about huge numbers of slaves being released, these legendary traditions may indeed be doubted as to the exact facts of the case, whether there were really that many being turned loose. He says, and probably are greatly exaggerated, but they are nevertheless conclusive as the exponents of the spirit which animated the church at that time concerning the duty of Christian masters. It was felt that in a thoroughly Christianized society, there could be no room for despotism on the one hand and slavery on the other. The Canadian philosopher Paul Chamberlain, he says in AD 315, only 2 years after the Edict of Milan, the Christian Emperor Constantine took the small step of criminalizing the act of stealing children for the purpose of bringing them up as slaves. Well, in the Old Testament, stealing somebody was already death penalty. Okay? Took the civil government a while. But here you have them doing this under the influence of Christians. Over the next few centuries, Christian bishops and councils called for the redemption and freeing of slaves, and Christian monks freed many themselves. The effects were stunning. By the 12th century, slaves in Europe were rare, and by the 14th century, they were almost unknown on that continent, including England. So in a world that had known this, that's how the world had functioned and operated, into this world come these seeds, and what happens? We go, and as centuries go by, what happened? Gone. Slavery. Gone. Under the influence of Christianity. Now, European slavery was revived. I think as I said this when we were in the last class, the Empire Strikes Back. See, European slavery was revived in the 17th century by the British, and then they were followed by the Portuguese and the Spanish. But the abolitionist movement, so here we have, in the 17th century, we have this revival of slavery for economic reasons. After the influence of Christianity had pretty much wiped it out. Well, here comes new economic circumstances, so back comes slavery, the British, Spanish, Portuguese, and then the abolitionist movement. In response to that, the abolitionist movement of the 18th and 19th centuries was led by believers in Christ. That's why it just kills me that people in slavery. I said, who do you think was at work in telling the world this was immoral? It was believers in Christ. That's who did it. William Wilberforce, Charles Spurgeon, John Wesley, William Lloyd Garrison, Charles Finney, Harriet Beecher Stowe, on and on and on. That's who was doing it. Can you find people who are holding up the Bible and saying it's, of course you can. You can find people saying all kinds of things. I want you to see what was the thrust and what did the people recognize. They realized in those seeds from those texts that slavery was something that ultimately was inconsistent with the brotherhood and the fellowship of man. And so you saw it go away. When it comes back, it is then attacked by Christians, by believers in the Lord Jesus Christ. And they also had those texts in terms of Western colonial slavery. They had those texts condemning kidnapping and slave trading in Exodus 21:16, 1 Timothy 1:10, activities that characterize colonial slavery. So there you had something that was so clear and definite that that's exactly what you're doing. You're going to Africa and taking people and bringing them. Never right. And so they had those texts. They had the seed texts. And they were the force that brought an end to slavery. And the fact God didn't forbid Christians in the first century from owning slaves, didn't outright forbid that. The fact he didn't forbid them from owning slaves, but rather tolerated a regulated form of first century Greco-Roman slavery, doesn't mean that's his ideal for mankind. That doesn't mean that. See, his ideal is brotherhood and equality. But it's possible, is it not, that the world had gotten so twisted and so dark and things had gotten so tangled up, sin and evil, that he was willing to tolerate less than his ideal as a concession to the hardness of men's hearts, as he did with divorce, by the way, as you see in Matthew chapter 19. Or maybe he tolerated it because mandating the immediate release of all slaves in that social context would have caused anarchy, which would have caused immense suffering. Is that possible? That saying that would have caused anarchy and then would have caused great suffering as the gospel exploded across the Roman world? I think that's indeed likely. In other words, maybe the thorn of slavery. Is it possible that the thorn of slavery needed to be removed slowly? Perhaps society first needed to be altered under Christianity's influence to be able to handle such a change without overwhelming adverse side effects? Is that possible? That things had gotten so tangled and sin had gotten so wrapped in there that if you just come in with the meat cleaver, that the consequent suffering would be worse than if we extract this thing slowly. You see, is that possible? Can an omniscient God see that and think that? And we sit in judgment of him and say, you couldn't do that. You see? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? You see, where were you? Let me read to you what James Dunn, I heard that bell, I'm going to give you this quote and then you can take off. James Dunn, on that idea about the adverse side effects. James Dunn is a very well-known theologian, New Testament scholar. He says, slavery was an established fact of life in the ancient world. As many as 1/3 of the inhabitants of most large urban centers were slaves. The economies of the ancient world could not have functioned without slavery. Consequently, a responsible challenge to the practice of slavery would have required a complete reworking of the economic system and a complete rethinking of social structures, which was scarcely thinkable at the time, except in idealistic or anarchic terms. See, a price comes with anarchy. People suffer and people die in anarchy. And so I look at God and I just say, I trust you because you are good and holy and just and right. I trust you that what you're doing. But don't give me this idea that God is over here saying, yeah, I'm instituting slavery and that's what I want for mankind. He doesn't.